There's a rumor going around that DC Comics is threatening to blacklist anyone who was associated with Comicsgate. It's sad that coming to paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Cancel Vacation. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a social justice social media mob looking to cancel her in this all-new E-Steam series adventure. Pre-order E-Steam Cancel Vacation on Amazon.com today. Now, I believe that this threat to blacklist Comicsgate associates is due to the fact that DC Comics is seeing how competitive the new modern comic book marketplace is becoming. And because they're scared of not being able to retain talent, what they want to do is threaten people as related to being associated with Comicsgate in an effort to try to hold on to talent, because they've lost a lot of talent like James Tinian IV to deals at places like Substack. And the big problem I'm seeing with DC Comics is they are completely out of touch with the modern comic marketplace, because Comicsgate no longer has the impact that it did almost 3 or 4 years ago, and the whole comic creative marketplace is changing so fast that Comicsgate no longer is anything people are talking about anymore. So trying to threaten freelancers and saying that you're going to blacklist them, that really doesn't faze a lot of these independent comic creators, because a lot of independent comic creators are now weighing options that they didn't have 30 years ago. Now, 30 years ago, the name DC Comics meant something on somebody's resume, and saying that you wrote a comic in DC's brand, like Superman, Batman, or Wonder Woman, or even one of the lower tier titles like The Heckler, that really meant something back 30 years ago. But your DC Comics has gone through a serious decline over the last 20 years under the mismanagement of Dan Didio, and the value of the DC Comics brand is not as prestigious as it was almost 20 years ago. Now, back in 2011, your DC Comics decided to end its classic DC universe and reboot with the New 52. And with that reboot to the New 52, the DC Comics brand started to go into a serious decline that impacted not only the publishing division, but also impacted the merchandising division, lowering the complete value of all DC Comics products, DC Comics merchandise, and lowered the value of DC Comics as an intellectual property. So your DC Comics does not have the same resonance anymore as a brand name, and it does not really impact people like it used to. So many of your modern comic creators like myself, when we hear a threat like this, we look at it and laugh at it, because working at DC Comics no longer has that prestige that it did back in the late 90s or the early 2000s. Now, back in the 90s or the early 2000s, getting an offer to work at DC Comics meant something. It meant you would have arrived. But these days, in an age where books that were once selling 6 to 7 figures like Batman can barely do 30,000 units, the working at DC does not have that same relevance, and it does not resonate with today's comic creators. And even worse than not resonating with the comic creators, most comic creators look at the compensation that they're going to get for working at a DC Comics, and they're not seeing much value that's related to their paychecks as related to working for this brand. Now, your DC Comics still hires most of its talent through work for hire contracts, and with a work for hire contract, you have to work at a page rate. And today's page rates are just so low they really are not even worth most creators' time, because most of your page rates for your writers and your artists barely pay below minimum wage. I mean, when you look at the page rates for a comic and you compare it to the month of work you have to do to get an issue out, you're not making more than a guy at Walmart or Target, because the average comic pro at the top of the tier as a writer makes $110 a page, and the average artist at the top of the tier only makes maybe $200 a page. And when you do the math, on said comic at $110 a page, if you're writing a script times 22, that's $2,420. And when you do it at $200 a page times 22, that's $4,400 a month. And in a city like New York City, that doesn't even cover your rent and your bills as related to your living expenses. So most creators, they look at working at DC and they don't see it paying for them, because as related to any project they're working on, the only compensation you're going to get are their page rates, and they don't see any sort of royalty sharing as related to sales or any sort of bonus benchmarks for trying to get these books up as related to their sales. And even worse, many of these creators can go out here and create a great new character and they won't get any compensation if that character is used in an animated series or merchandising. So many creators don't really have that incentive to go out here and work for a place like DC Comics, because the pay rates and the compensation are so low, and they don't get to keep any of their intellectual property or get compensated for their intellectual property. So many comic creators, when they hear again that threat, oh, you're going to blacklist me for being associated with Comicsgate, many comic pros and aspiring comic pros laugh at that threat, because they look over at those creators who are a part of the Comicsgate movement, and they start to look at the figures as related to their crowdfunding projects and see that many of these creators, they are making in the high five figures, the high six figures, and some are even making millions of dollars on their intellectual properties that they own, and they're the ones who are profiting from their own creations. And because those aspiring comic pros and comic pros see that they can make lots more money on platforms like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, or even go out here and head over to Amazon and launch their own comics, they're saying to DC that this threat that they're making is not one that scares them, and the reason why it doesn't scare them is because they see that working at DC Comics is only a job that's only going to pay them small change, and it's just not worth their time. And when they look at the current DC Comics, which is following down the footsteps of the road that the so-called SJW Marvel was going, many more creators are not seeing any incentive to go and work at DC Comics, because they believe that they're going to be creatively stifled by your DC Comics, and because they believe they're going to be stifled creatively by DC Comics and forced to write within the whole guidelines of social justice and woke narratives that have been pushed in recent DC comic books like the Jonathan Kent Superman and Tim Drake Robin. Many aspiring comic pros and comic pros are not really seeing that working at DC Comics is actually worth it. So your DC Comics, if this rumor is true, is really shooting themselves in the foot by threatening people who are associated with Comicsgate, because it shows how out of touch they are with their own industry. Comicsgate wasn't popular for a good 2 years for now, and many independent creators now they're going in their own direction, and it's no longer about Comicsgate anymore. It's about creators going out here and making profits for themselves, like I did 10 years ago when I started the SJS Direct imprint. Not 10 years ago, it was 2009 actually, but back in 2009, I started the SJS Direct imprint so I could maintain creative control and I could be able to create the stories that I wanted to create. And now that I'm branching out into comics like John Haynes at Death's Door, I want to go out here and tell great stories that I couldn't be able to go out here and tell in platforms like DC or Marvel because they didn't really want to go out here and hire African American creators or even let us in the door. And that's one of the reasons why, again, many independent creators are leaving and not even thinking about Marvel and DC. And many seasoned comic pros now are headed over to platforms like Substack because they don't see themselves being able to be as creative and express themselves the way that they want to. And you can't do that anything over at DC and Marvel these days except promote identity politics. So many comic pros and aspiring comic pros, they are looking at the comic book marketplace, and it has really changed. And again, we just see how out of touch your DC Comics is if this rumor is true and they're threatening to blacklist people. But how does a blacklist have an impact on creators when the creators no longer care about the whole business that you're trying to keep them out of? That's a critical question I want to ask the people at DC Comics if I get a chance, because they're following down the same failed road as that clique that was rumored to be around that was supposed to try to gatekeep the whole comic book industry. With the Whisper Network. And none of this stuff is affecting the business of independent comic creators who have a passion for comics. No, many of those independent comic creators are just making the stories that they want, putting them on the marketplace, and not concerning themselves with the gossip, the rumors, or the drama. And they're just letting the marketplace tell us what the audience wants. And that's all that's going on these days. But everybody, when your DC Comics talking about threatening to blacklist freelancers, this is quite laughable, because how can you blacklist somebody if they're not concerned about working for you? All you're doing is hindering your own progress, and all you're doing is keeping yourself from working with talent that is possibly on its way to the next level. Because if a guy or a girl is out here and he has made six figures, they're not thinking about working at DC Comics. No, they're thinking about taking their own brand to the next level. And once they take their brand to the next level, they're going to think about going out here and publishing their own stuff and keeping the integrity of their product to what it is. So this whole threat, it's one that just comes out of weakness and comes out of desperation, because DC Comics knows it's losing talent and it's trying to hold on to talent, but the talent sees its value, and the talent sees how much the DC brand has declined, because the impact of DC Comics is not what it was 30 years ago, and it's not even what it was 5 years ago, because if writers like James Tynion IV are willing to move away from writing Batman to go out here and take a deal with Substack, it shows you how little value DC superheroes have and how little impact DC superheroes have to creators today, because your creators today are thinking about creating the characters of tomorrow, and they're thinking about building a brand that will help them build wealth for their future. Now, if you want to pick up my first comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find it on Kindle for 99 cents. And if you want to pick up my upcoming comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, I'm hoping to have that on Kickstarter soon, where we have 50% of the art complete. And I'm hoping to get the rest of the art so I can get to the letterer and get this book to print. So That book is on its way. But if you want to try out some of my other action-packed fantasy fiction, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spencerella trilogy, you can find those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online booksellers everywhere today.